The text arrived at 7:12 a.m. Subject line curt, no flourish. I can't stand by it any longer. I told them. For a moment I thought it was a prank. My sister Lena didn't send impulsive emails. She thought things through. She circled them like a hawk. But then my phone exploded. A dozen texts from family, a voicemail from my manager, one from the foundation's legal counsel. I read it twice before my hands stopped shaking. My sister turned me in. I told the mirror as I brushed my teeth. The sentence tasted like metal. It sounded like betrayal. If you'd asked me what would ruin my life, I'd have named scandal, a bad headline, a lawsuit. I hadn't imagined it would feel like being handed a key to a locked room I'd never known existed. My name is Ana Morales. I'm 42. For 15 years, I ran the Morales Cultural Trust, the family nonprofit Dad founded after he retired from business. We curated exhibits, funded scholarships, repatriated artifacts. At least that's what we told donors. The reality had always been a little messy, but messy felt manageable. Trustworthy people signed checks. We did good work. The comparisons at Thanksgiving. Anna keeps things running. Thank God we have her. They were small coronations you wear until they press. Then Lena, the sister who used to steal my crayons and hide my toys, sent an anonymous tip to the state attorney. She accused me of diverting funds to a private account under a shell company. The news hit the foundation like lightning. The board called an emergency meeting. A probe was opened. Friends I'd known my entire life avoided my calls. Lena's text that morning made the charge personal. I couldn't lie anymore. You deserve the truth. I sat at my kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee and my laptop open to the trust's financial dashboard. Numbers blurred. There, between payroll and program expenses, a flagged transfer from 3 years ago blinked like an accusation. It went to a name I didn't recognize, Magnolia Logistics. A memo line, shipment handling, private. My first thought was denial. My second was disbelief. I hadn't authorized anything like that. My third, sharp and cold, was suspicion. Somebody had been moving things in the dark. Before I could call Lena or my lawyer, a knock sounded on the door. 2 men in plain suits looked through the peephole. State investigators, one said, flashing a badge. We need to ask you some questions about the Morales Cultural Trust. I swallowed all the explanations I'd rehearsed and led them to my office, palms slightly damp. Behind me, the house felt too small and too loud, like the uneasy pause before a storm breaks. Questions arrived in measured tones. Dates, signatures, authorizations. They wanted the trust's bank statements, vendor contracts, shipment manifests. I handed over everything. It felt like handing someone pieces of myself. As the agents rifled through files, one of them paused over an old shipping log tucked beneath a stack of donor letters. He frowned, then straightened, eyes narrowing. Have you heard of Magnolia Logistics? He asked. I had to admit I hadn't. He explained it was a freight company that specialized in discreet shipping for private collectors, the sort of service that don't leave public footprints. When he asked for contact records, I realized with a jolt that the flagged transfer had routing numbers and timestamps linking it to a freight hub 3 states away. Someone in our organization had outsourced something privately, and the ledger didn't match our public accounts. Later that day, I called Lena. Her voice was even, but strained. I didn't want it to be you, Ani. I told them because I wanted an honest investigation. If it's a mistake, it will come out. But I saw the emails you deleted. I saw the invoices that disappeared. Her words weren't the barb I'd expected. They were heavier, as if they carried the weight of a truth she dragged out of a corner and couldn't put back. That night I stayed in the office until the cleaning crew left. I pulled older ledgers, paper journals Dad kept before we went digital. He had a habit of hiding receipts behind other receipts, as if memory needed camouflage. In the bottom of a file labeled Donor Correspondences, I found a small folder, brittle with age. Inside were photocopied shipping manifests, names in handwriting I recognized as Dad's, and photographs. Wooden crates stamped with polite museum labels loan, Morales Trust, Catalog 47, but also another mark, faint, stamped in red, M-Export. The photos showed crates opened beside a warehouse desk, A man in a suit signed off with a name I'd never seen, but the initials matched Dad's middle name. Memory is a trickster. I remembered a summer as a child, Dad returning from a trip with stories about private acquisitions and a photograph of him beside a carved mask he said rescued a piece of craft from decay. We'd celebrated with cake. We'd told donors it was all about preservation. But these manifests, the dates didn't align with the museum loans we'd reported. Someone had been moving objects under a different ledger, and my name, by proximity, by my access, by habit, had been the key that turned the lock. I started tracing the transactions. Magnolia Logistics receipts led to a shell company layered behind others, and then to a P.O. box that pointed to a warehouse outside town. Lena's call the next morning said investigators had found a crate at that warehouse. Inside, dozens of artifacts listed in the trust's public catalog, and some pieces that had never been reported. Among them, a wooden chest full of paperwork wrapped in oilcloth. Documents in that chest were older, handwritten in ink that had bled through decades, shipping lists, names, and a ledger titled simply M, Accounts Private. As I read, the letters formed a pattern I didn't want to admit. The trust's collection wasn't just curated, parts of it had been trafficked, cataloged as rescue, while someone siphoned things to private clients. The next call from Lena cut through the room like glass. "They want to question Dad," she said. "They found his passport stamps." It's deeper than we thought. For the first time, all the stories from my childhood, the late-night talking, the secrecy, Dad's insistence that some things were too fragile for headlines began to rearrange into a map that led somewhere dark. My hands trembled now, not from fear of accusation, but from the terrible clarity. The person we trusted most might have built our legacy on someone else's loss. I drove to the warehouse before anyone could stop me. It smelled of dust and diesel, the kind of smell that ages a person 2 years for every month. The manager, an older woman with tired eyes, recognized Dad's handwriting on the crate tags. He came in like he owned the place, she said. Paid cash. Said it was for a museum loan. She didn't remember seeing paperwork that matched our nonprofit's public files. She handed me a clipboard with signatures. I traced Dad's looping script and felt something like betrayal and grief braid together. Inside the crate were objects that made my throat close, carved figurines, ceremonial textiles, a lacquered mask with weathered teeth. The labels tied them to villages I'd only read about in academic journals. The manifests claimed donation for preservation, but accompanying documents, old government permits, letters in a different language, hinted at payments made to middlemen, to officials, to a network that smoothed exports. Someone had bought plausible deniability and wrapped it in paperwork. When I confronted the board, faces I'd known since childhood looked smaller, like paper cutouts. Some were angry, some were stunned. Others were furious that our reputation had become a target. Lena sat at the back, hands folded. She didn't look vindictive, she looked tired beyond her years. The investigators widened their net. They called anthropologists, foreign archivists, even embassies. The story grew wings. Reporters smelled it like hounds scenting blood. Donors wrestled with their conscience. I watched supporters retreat and new calls demand accountability. Every paper that hit my desk seemed to pry open a seam we'd been stitching for decades. In a folder labeled Confidential M, I found correspondence between Dad and an overseas dealer. He'd written about urgent purchasing and discreet shipment. The signature matched a flourish in brown ink I had seen 100 times. The real revelation, however, came when Lena gave me something she'd held back, a stack of old family photographs from before the trust's founding. In one, Dad stands on a village shore, a child on his shoulders, cradling a carved idol. Written on the back in his hand, saved from a market will find a home. Beneath that, a newspaper clipping. The headline named a small coastal town whose community had been fighting the loss of its cultural patrimony for years. The dates aligned. The photos weren't just souvenirs. They were traces of a pattern. Objects moved at a time when there were fewer regulations, fewer questions, and too much goodwill to see motivation. Lena's motive came into focus then, not as simple betrayal, but as an act of forced conscience. She'd watched Dad's tales turn into transactions, watched my role in the trust wash over the edges into ambiguity. She'd tried to speak before, quiet comments over dinner, small notes tucked into Mom's mail, but when I didn't act, when the ledger continued to blink, she took the only step she believed would force truth. We had choices. Protect the family name and risk burying what was clearly wrong, or pull at the thread and unravel everything. In the privacy of my car, the envelope with those photographs on the passenger seat, I realized the decision had been made for me. If we hid it, the artifacts would remain displaced, and the trust would be a velvet glove for a fist of secrets. If we exposed it, we might lose everything: donors trust, the work we'd done, but perhaps it would be the first honest thing our name had done in years. I called Lena. "I'm going public," I said. Her silence after that was not arrogance, but relief. "Do it right," she replied. "Make it about restitution, not revenge." That was her gift, temperance in fury. I drafted a statement that night: admission of gaps, immediate suspension of certain programs, outreach to communities where the objects originated. It felt like stepping off a cliff wearing work boots, terrifying and necessary. The press conference was ugly and beautiful at once. Reporters asked sharp questions while community leaders sat behind me, their faces unreadable. I spoke slowly, measuring each sentence as if it were a tool. I admitted the truth we'd discovered. Some items in our collection had unclear provenance. Some acquisitions were labeled as rescue when the trail suggested otherwise. I didn't blame Dad at the podium. The dead do not wear crowns, but I framed the issue as institutional failure. People clapped and hissed in equal measure. The fallout was immediate. Grants were paused. A major donor withdrew. The board reconstituted. I expected fury. Instead, the hardest part was watching the faces of those who had believed in us feel cheated. We initiated repatriation talks, an independent audit, and a long-term plan to partner with source communities on cultural stewardship. The legal fight with unnamed private buyers and shell companies dragged on for months. Lawyers on both sides wrote letters heavy enough to paper aisles. Lena and I met in the old kitchen, amid the echo of memory. She sat across from me, her fingers wrapped around a mug. "You could have shut this down," I said. "You could have saved everything." She looked at me steady. "I couldn't keep living like that, Anna. I couldn't watch people use our name to hide things." Her apology was small and real. We both understood that trust had cracks that couldn't be sealed overnight. Months later, the repatriation began. Crates we'd once labeled as loans were cataloged with new care. Some objects returned to coastal villages where elders lit fires and told stories about the carvings. We funded community programs to restore and interpret their own heritage. It wasn't complete justice, restitution never is, but it was movement in the right direction. The Morales Cultural Trust, once a tidy ledger of good intentions, became something messier and truer, a platform to repair harm. In time, the tabloids moved on. Our donor base restructured around transparency, and younger board members pushed for accountability measures that would have made Dad bristle, but would have made our work sustainable. Lena and I rebuilt a fractious sisterhood into cautious partnership. The headlines that had promised ruin became chapters in a larger story about humility and correction. At the 5-year mark, I walked into the Trust's flagship gallery, now co-curated with voices from the places we had once taken from. A plaque hung near the entrance, in recognition of harm done and the work to repair it. Beneath it, a small framed photograph Lena had found years earlier, Dad on that same beach, not as an accusation, but as a reminder. People are complicated, legacies even more so. When someone asked me later if I regretted Lena turning me in, I didn't hesitate. "No," I said. It hurt. It cost us. But it woke us up. Some truths are the only cure we have. The secret we discovered had been terrible, but it forced us to choose what our name would mean going forward. In the end, truth did what secrecy never could. It demanded responsibility and, absurdly, offered a way to rebuild.